I thought it would be nice to put everything in a little context, or in the context of the energy transition. So that's really what we're going to be doing today. Some of the things will be, if you like, I'll try to get a very top view of what the energy transition is looking like, and hopefully we can get a few conclusions together out of that. So following, well, basically from Zach's introduction, I will not repeat that, but basically I'm bringing 30 years of experience in energy and chemicals, and I have recently founded this company called WeR+Energy. And the purpose of this company is basically to help explain the energy transition. I truly believe that if we understand what we're doing, you know, we will do it better. So I will, this company will try to help explain it. And as we start our journey, let me also tell you, this is not the first time we're doing an energy transition. I'm sure some of you know about the history of how energy has evolved. And I was reading a book not long ago, and I heard about Denis Papin, who was a Frenchman, who was one of the first persons to actually get steam moving machines. And you know, back from the 17th and the 18th century, you know, we started producing the first steam machines. And one of the most famous ones is the Newcomen machine. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but I sometimes wonder, how did this whole revolution started? And it was a funny story. Everything started because there was not enough wood. People were using wood to make ships in, you know, at the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century, and the price of wood went up. And then people said, well, why don't we start using coal instead? And as they start mining the coal, then the mines were usually they were inundated with water, so they had to figure out a way to get the water out of the mines, and that's how they invented the first steam machines. And then 100 years later, they put one of those machines on rails, and that's how locomotion started. You know, so it's really funny how when you take it back, you find that there's always a little story behind it that triggered all the changes. If we go into the beginning of the 20th century, well, there's also a lot of debate. Academics have been talking a lot about why is it that Ford decided to use internal combustion engines using gasoline or petrol instead of electricity? Because in those days, electric cars were more common than internal combustion cars. But it just turns out to be one of the little quirks in history. And well, we know the end of that story, or at least we know where the story is today. Although it may change in the future again, as we will see. Winston Churchill was the admiral in the British Navy in the beginning of the First World War, and he made a key decision. He took the key decision to switch the ships to use oil or liquid fuels rather than coal. And that also spurred, you know, an enormous revolution on the world of oil, which then started the decline of coal as a percentage of the energy mix. So again, all I'm trying to tell you is this is not the first transition. Transitions have happened before. And if you go back to the 1950s, the same thing happened when the great smog of London that killed, well, thousands of people at the time. Parliament forced people to switch and stop burning coal in cities. And well, obviously, we know today that that opened the road to using natural gas in a bigger way. And of course, we have the United States establishing the Environmental Protection Agency in the early 70s. We know how some of those things have evolved. But how's our energy mix changed over time? Well, I went back to the year 1800 and I found this. Back in those days, we were obviously using mostly wood. And then coal comes in as the big energy supply. This is global, by the way. And then oil picks up in the beginning of the 20th century, and then gas comes in. And it's interesting to see how other fuels or other sources of energy are starting to grow. And you know, we are already in a major transition, which is one of the most exciting transitions in history. So let's become part of this and let's do it together. This is what I will set up as background in what I'm going to be talking about over the next few minutes. I am planning to talk for the next sort of 40 minutes or so, just to finish my presentation, and then the plan is that we will still have some time open for questions and any other comments that you may want to add. So where are we today? What is the context right now? I would like us to think of what are the energy sources that the world uses today, and what do we use those sources for? Again, looking at the historical profile over the last 40, 50 years, we see that, I mean, basically today we're still using a lot of oil as an energy source. And this is primary energy. So if you think of the energy diet of the world, about a third of that energy is coming from oil. We have coal and gas, which are also, I don't know, 27, 24%. If you take all of them together, it is over 80%. So still over 80% of our energy comes from oil, coal, and gas. We have hydropower, we have nuclear, and we also have the emerging, and I still call them emerging, the renewable sources like solar and wind, which even though they are growing very fast, they're still quite small. And this is what I want to give as a kind of an initial statement. The energy transition will require big efforts, but we're not going to get rid of oil and gas, you know, very quickly. We have a long way to go. The question is, how can we make the changes today and put the regulation in place that will help accelerate the changes? But I mean, how much investment would you need to bring solar and wind from their current level of just a few percentage points? How would you bring them up to 25% or 50%? It would take enormous amounts of money and time to be able to do that. We just need to work and be conscious of that. So today we're still in a world dominated by carbon. And who has those carbon reserves? Well, let's look at oil first. This is a map with the top 10 reserves of oil. And these are reserves. So this is oil under the ground. I'm showing everything in billions of barrels. And I need to bring this up because, of course, most of you are in France, and when we use the term billions, I know that not everybody, you know, agrees on the terminology. I am using the number that we normally use in the United States and the UK, which refers to 1,000 millions or milliards, as I think we call them we call them in France. And so I'm really talking, yes, it's 10 to the 9, thousands of millions of barrels. And we find that the largest reserves of oil are not in Saudi Arabia, which is surprising for some people. They're actually in Venezuela. Venezuela has more oil than even Saudi Arabia. Now, the Venezuelan oil has problems. It is very heavy. It is not easy to extract and to process, but they definitely have a lot. Where then we have some of the other countries like, of course, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Kuwait, Iraq. We have Canada, we have Russia, and even the United States. Look at the concentration. I don't know if you had ever wondered about this, but 86% of all the reserves in the world are coming basically, or are located in 10 countries. That's big concentration. And you may be thinking, what about other places like Angola or Nigeria or Mexico? They are also producers of oil. They just don't happen to have, to be in the top 10 reserves. But the story gets more interesting when you add another dimension, not just who has the reserves, but who produces from those reserves, who produces more. And then we get to an interesting chart, which you can see on the right side. The one on the left is just the bar chart of the reserves that I showed you on the map. But the bar on the right side tells a very different story. The biggest producer of oil, as of 2019, I know 2020 will be very different, but the biggest producer of oil in 2019 was not Saudi Arabia, it was not Russia, it was the United States. The United States has more than tripled its production in a little bit more than 10 years. And at least until 2019, they were already producing over 16 million barrels per day. I think this is an interesting realization. There has been an energy revolution happening in the United States, which is related, obviously, to shale oil and shale gas. These are the different sources of what we call tight reserves. And it's interesting because when you put that in context with the rest of the world, actually the reserves of oil have continued increasing. They have grown about 1% per year over the last 10 years. And I mean, when I was a kid, they used to tell us that we only had oil left for the next 50 years. And today we're saying, well, I'm over 50 now, and we're talking that we still have oil for the next 80 or 100 years. Now, of course, the big question is not whether we will run out of oil. The question is whether demand for oil will decline before supply does. And this is also something we're going to come back to in a few. This is something we'll come back to in a few minutes. Okay, so you may know about this already, but in case you don't, some people ask me, what's the difference between shale and conventional oil? And I found a really nice way to explain it, which is using this little graph right here. If you want to understand the phenomenon of shale versus conventional, you will find it here. Conventional oil is when you have something like one of those donuts that are full of jelly, and you only have one point of contact, and that's where the reserves are sort of concentrated, and then you can extract them. These are the conventional fields. When you extract oil or gas from shale, it looks more like a tiramisu cake, or you can imagine how you have to go down and then you have to go horizontal. And I hope that I can, extract a little smile from you when you look at this. And well, I showed this to somebody who works in the financial industry, and he didn't know anything about oil and gas. And he said, Manuel, thank you for showing this. I will never forget the difference between shale and conventional. And I know that shale has a lot of challenges, especially with the environmental issues. Here in the United Kingdom, as Zach said, I'm connecting with you from London. Here they were opening up the possibility of extracting gas in the northwest from shale, and after several years of discussions, they finally started doing it, and then they canceled it as soon as there were a few tremors caused by the fracking of rocks. So we know that in Europe, this is very limited, even though there's a lot of shale gas and shale oil in Europe. The issue is more an environmental pushback. But the United States is going ahead. Just look at this map. This is a map of the United States from space in the middle of the night. You can see you can identify some of the lights of the big cities. You can find, for example, New York over here and Chicago over here, or Atlanta and Houston. You can find some of those places. And then Minneapolis over here in Minnesota. But if you look further northwest to the top left, you will find some lights burning out there. Can you see them? These lights here, that is not a city. That is North Dakota, where they are exporting or exploring and producing shale oil today, and they produce little flares of gas that they have to burn, and you can see them from space. So this is just to tell us that even considering all the environmental restrictions, the Americans are pushing ahead with this in a big way. That's why they tripled their production over the last 10 years. And that has brought big changes also in prices. This is the historical price of oil since the 1970s until today. And I would like you to focus on the blue line. That is the nominal price of oil in money of the day, if you like. And for those of you who know about the history of oil, you will have heard about, or you may remember the famous oil shocks, like the first oil shock that happened in the late 1973, that increased the prices from $2 to about $11 per barrel. Then there was the shock of the Iranian Revolution a few years later, which brought the prices up to almost $40 per barrel. Now, those numbers look small today, but if you adjust them by inflation, these were the type of jumps that we were seeing at the time. So they were tremendous jumps, and that's why basically the world economy went into recession after those sudden changes. And then we have, of course, another big jump in the price, which happens at the beginning of the 2000s, and it takes place throughout several years. This is mostly driven by Chinese demand. It's so important that even after the peak in prices in 2008, and then we have the financial crisis, prices come back up again, because the third jump, this one is driven by demand, and demand doesn't go away. Even after the financial crisis, if there was somebody in China who bought a car before the crisis, that person still has a car after the crisis. So those prices come back up, and they generally stay up there for another 5 years or so, until the fall in 2014. And it's really amazing, but that fall was caused by American production and also by the Saudis and the Russians trying to maintain market share. Today, what's the price of oil? Well, it hit close to 50 yesterday from what I was reading, but where will the price be in the future? It's one of the hardest questions we can try to answer. We, in the consultancy, for example, we do not try to forecast the price of oil. We think more on the level of scenarios, but today our scenarios, even the highest scenarios, don't go much higher than about 80, because we don't believe the price will go as high as 100 or more. In the near future, simply because there's, number one, there's less demand, and number two, there is additional production available to come on stream as soon as prices go up. So this is really interesting how the world of oil has changed significantly. Just go back to 2012, 2013. We were all used to paying $100 per barrel or more. And today we cannot even pass 50. So this is all important. And I'm not only talking about history, of course, this has to do with the demand for fuels, or so the economics of fuels, but also the economics of chemicals. When you make chemicals and petrol, you need naphtha for that. And I want you to see how the price of naphtha follows the price of crude very, very closely. In this chart, you can see crude oil is the blue line. You can read it on the left axis, and naphtha is the gray line. You can read it on the right axis. But basically, what is this telling us? The minute that there's a change in the price of oil, which is related to political events as well as supply demand, then it will have a knock-on effect on the world of fuels and the world of chemicals. And this is also important because if you want to favor the transition and you want to use alternative fuels, they have to, or alternative sources of energy, they ultimately have to compete against oil. And so at a low oil environment, it makes it harder for many of those sources to compete. So this is the context. Again, I'm still in this section. If you want to see the same story for natural gas, well, the biggest supplies of natural gas, the biggest reserves, are located in places like Russia, Iran, Qatar. Saudi Arabia doesn't have too much gas, which is interesting. And then you have, again, places like the United States and Venezuela, etc. But it's interesting to see. So Qatar is very big in gas, whereas Saudi is very big in oil. I spent 5 years of my life living in Saudi Arabia, so I was very close to some of these stories. And if we do the same thing for coal, well, the story of coal is different. No coal in the Middle East, not much coal in Africa, except for South Africa. But when you see the big reserves are actually in the US, China, Russia, India, Australia, even Germany. We have a slightly different geography when it comes to coal. Now, I won't show you the producers, but China is by far the biggest producer and by far the biggest consumer. Everybody else is about 1/10 of the size in terms of how much they produce every year. Now, that's where the energy comes from. That's, if you like, the diet of the world. The next question is, what do we use that energy for? And looking at the International Energy Agency, and you can roughly work these numbers out, and it basically turns out that about almost 40%, a little bit less, of the energy is ultimately used to produce power. This is just electricity. We also have residential and commercial heating, and we have industry heating. This is what we use in cement plants, steel plants, etc. Transportation fuels. Some people think they are a bigger portion, but no, it's only about 18% when you take all of the energy, all of the primary energy. And then we have what we call non-combustibles or non-energy. This is the world of petrochemicals. This is where you would see things like the things that end up in plastics or synthetic fibers or synthetic rubber, all those things, which is also quite small. It's only about 6%. So what are the main sources? If you overlap the supply and the demand, I'm just going to do this qualitatively, but you can find obviously the majority of power comes from gas and coal. And we have, of course, renewables and nuclear, and just a little bit of oil. In some countries, they still burn gas oil or fuel oil. We don't like doing that, but they still do. When you look at the residential and industrial heat or that sort of energy, well, then it's mostly gas, and to some extent also coal and renewables. It also varies by country, of course. When you look at transportation, most of transportation fuels are coming from oil. Some are from gas, but the majority is oil. And when you look at basically the non-combustibles, you're really talking, most of it comes from naphtha, oil, or some of the gas fractions like ethane, propane, those kind of hydrocarbons. And there's a little bit of chemistry made from coal, but it's not very big. Now, all of this, of course, creates externalities. Look at this. I want you to consider this chart again. 90%, or well, more than 90% of this pie is basically end up in combustion. You end up burning the oil, the gas, and the coal. even chemicals, even though you don't burn, you're somehow capturing carbon in many times in chemicals. We also use some heating in the production of chemicals themselves. So this is, we need to put all of this into context. But that's my point, and that's the consequence I'm talking about. The vast majority of the oil, gas, and coal are burnt. And this generates, of course, externalities, starting with carbon into the atmosphere. And so if you want to sort of change or how can I say, try to solve this problem, well, then probably the best guess or the best bet would be to start with electrification. It would be the most immediate and the most promising territory for the energy transition. Why? Go back one slide and just remember what we were saying. Of course, power generation is already the biggest source of energy, the biggest consumer of energy. If you convert more of your electricity to renewables or nuclear or non-carbon sources, and you convert some of your transportation to electric, you are already solving a big part of the problem. It's going to be a lot easier to do that than to, for example, substitute energy or into industry or some of the other sources. Okay. So this is the context. Let's talk a little bit more about externalities. It is important to understand the carbon cycle. And if you think of how the world was or how the Earth worked before the Industrial Revolution, we know that between the atmosphere, the oceans, the biosphere, there's a big exchange of carbon. All right, when plants grow, and then when plants decay, and the algae on the oceans, there are big transfers of carbon between these big systems. Also, the Earth itself captures or has a lot of the carbon itself. What is new now, or what is changing? Well, what we're doing today, as the human civilization has grown and exploded in many ways, today what is happening is we are bringing we're bringing extra carbon into the system, and that carbon has basically moved from the geosphere to the atmosphere. And so now what's happening? The oceans are trying to absorb more carbon. The biosphere is also absorbing more carbon. We know that acidification in the oceans has gone up. We know the biosphere, many places are becoming greener, basically because of the extra carbon. But this imbalance is causing obviously other problems, starting with climate change and so forth. So let me tell you a little bit more. Where does the CO2 come from? And this is a nice chart that explains that. Let me make it a little bit clearer by pointing it out. Remember what we said, power generation is the biggest consumer of energy. It is also the biggest producer of CO2, not surprisingly. When you look at transportation, we have light road and heavy road, which are also taking a big chunk. It's going to, as I said, it's going to be harder to substitute the energy sources for industry. In the production of cement and iron and chemicals, we also generate a lot of CO2. Now, there are some developments taking place. We're using cement or concrete that can capture more carbon. We are using chemicals, or we're trying to find ways to make chemicals from carbon. But this is a little bit a longer shot, and it's going to take time. I think the biggest quick wins would be, as we said, in power generation and transportation. Now, let me tell you some more. What about emissions in 2020? The pandemic, this has been a very strange year. I'm sure we will all agree. However, don't expect a very big drop. We are probably thinking of anywhere 4, 5, 6%, 7% drop in 2020, because of course we still use power, we still use heating, and even though some of the sources of energy have been obviously very affected very strongly by the pandemic. I want to show you this photograph. I took it myself. I had to make a trip in June of this year, and I was changing planes in Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands. Now, I mean, you would see the same thing in Charles de Gaulle or in Heathrow, but it's if you have ever been into that airport, you will know that these screens would be completely full of flights, and it was amazing to see how they had only one screen with a little bit in the second screen, and all the other screens were empty. So this just tells us how the airline industry has lost billions and billions of dollars in lost revenue because of the pandemic. Okay, so we're explaining the situation. Let me tell you a little bit about sort of possible futures. Where do we see this transition taking place? And I'll tell you something straight on. There's no silver bullet. There's no solution that will fix everything. My view is that the transition is already happening, but it will be very fragmented, it will be local, and it will be different in different parts of the world. What can we do? Well, let's see. If we try to electrify, it will be easier to electrify transportation than it will be to electrify industry. There are even some important efforts to try to electrify air travel. And it's obviously, it would be just for light type of aircraft. But, if we are going to get started somewhere, this is the place to start. And I'm obviously assuming we're going to be using renewables or even nuclear power, which is non-carbon, to produce that electricity. This is one of those sometimes big confusions that people have. I mean, if you're producing your electricity from coal and you have an electric car, well, welcome, you now have a coal car. And you would be better off by just burning normal petrol as we used to before. So there we go. That's the part of the electrification. And there's, of course, the idea, yes, let's use as much renewables as possible, but we know renewables are variable, and that causes additional problems. The good news is that the price of renewables, or rather the cost to produce electricity from renewables, has gone down significantly. And today, photovoltaics, onshore wind, and even offshore wind have come down dramatically in terms of cost, and they are more competitive today than building a coal plant from scratch, and in many cases competing even against gas plants very, very well. So this is good. This is the good news. The bad news is the variability of renewables, and we still have to solve that problem in a good way. How can you do that? Well, of course, yes, I know we have nuclear power. I'll show you something in a minute that you will I'm sure you will associate with. We could also use hydrogen. We could also try to store that electricity with the use of batteries, but we still need big technological achievements, or big changes technologically to be able to do this in a big scale and in an economic way. And there's another one that is a bit of a silver bullet too, that especially the oil industry uses a lot, and this is the famous carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture utilization and storage, CCUS. There's been, I mean, people have talked about this technology for years, and it has promised a lot, but it hasn't really delivered much, at least so far. Now, let me tell you, because sometimes people look at this and they say, oh yeah, this is just one of the efforts by the oil industry to continue to be relevant, to continue burning fossil fuels with the promise that you're going to be able to capture that coal or that carbon later on. So my suggestion here is, because I was a bit cynical of this at the time, but then I realized that it's not only for the oil and gas companies. This is actually for everybody. We do need to remove coal or carbon from the atmosphere at some point. If we are to achieve the agreement or the numbers that we are committing to for the Paris Agreement, we need to take some coal out of the atmosphere. So this we have to see if this can become a reality one way or another. This will require, of course, huge human and financial resources. But let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Okay, many of you know about batteries. Battery technology is improving, but it's still slow, and batteries are heavy, and making the batteries themselves also poses lots of challenges. So it will be part of the solution, but I don't see it immediately solving the whole problem. Using hydrogen as a fuel is also complicated. Some people are talking about the hydrogen economy. Yes, but moving and burning carbon is not easy at all. Then people are talking about perhaps using fuel cells. And I saw a very interesting note about Airbus, which is already producing some prototype airplanes using hydrogen, using both direct combustion as well as fuel cells. And then nuclear power. Of course, most of you sitting in France, well, this is not news for you. Nuclear power is, in my opinion, a very good source of power. Not every government or everybody agrees around the world, but I do believe we need to put more research into nuclear power. We need to go into some of the other nuclear technologies, using thorium or using, the smaller scales, etc. But this could be also a very important part of the transition of the mix. So why was I telling you that it's important to capture carbon? This is what we said. The Paris Agreement establishes that to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to do two things. We need to reduce the amount of fossil fuels that we burn, and at some point, we need to create what we call negative emissions. And there are different options to do this. We can get the oceans to help us by having, you know, algae and things like that. We can grow and regenerate forests. We can also enhance absorption of carbon in soils. There's all these, I mean, there's different pieces of work that could be done. And there are these two technologies. One is called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, where you're growing biomass, you burn it to produce electricity, and then you capture that carbon and you feed it back. That could be a way to reduce, it would be a negative, you would be doing negative emissions. And the other one is direct air capture, which is obviously a great idea, but it's very difficult and we cannot do it at scale and efficiency. And we need to be careful of this thing that we call the budget illusion. This thing that says, oh, okay, let's use the budget now in the idea that somebody will develop the technology in the future. No, we need to start right now because doing these things will be hard and it will take time. But my message to you is we should not forget that we do need to take carbon out of the atmosphere one way or another. Okay, now there are some good news. We have in many ways decoupled emissions from economic growth. If you see how the world evolved over time, the GDP was going up and energy intensity was going up. But as you can see, at least recently, the production of CO2 has decoupled from economic growth. So these are good news. Now, of course, we need to bring that carbon line further down. Regulation is starting to help, and it's playing a bigger and bigger role. You will see, some of you will be aware of this. This was announced just yesterday or the day before, where you know, some of the climate plans are starting to become enshrined into law. In the last few months, many governments, even the Chinese, have been talking about becoming net zero. Here in the UK, they were saying the same thing, but of course they say it's going to happen in 2050 or 2060. That's a long way away. But when you see the European Commission suddenly saying, no, we need to be, you know, we need to drop the numbers by 55% by 2030, and we're putting it into law, that's when things, you know, start moving a lot, or should help innovation, and people will make plans accordingly. You are also probably familiar with the International Maritime Organization that has completely changed the type of fuels that we cannot use fuel oil with sulfur in vessels anymore. And this is ironically forcing some countries. The case of Mexico is kind of a sad story because now the government is not using renewables and they want to burn fuel oil because they don't have anybody to buy that fuel oil. So, you know, these are unintended consequences, but we have to work through them over time. Now, you are familiar with this, of course. In France, well, you have always been proud of a lot of the nuclear power that produces your electricity in a very clean way. You export electricity here to the UK, but I'm going to show you the example of the UK, which is quite interesting. I want you to see it here. This is the mix of electricity generation in the UK for the last 12 months. So it's basically the 12 months to September of 2020. And I want you to see. So we have nuclear power down here. This is the green line at the bottom, which is fairly stable. We have wind and solar, which are big or bigger, and but they're also variable. And you can see how solar grows during the summer and it declines during the winter. But what I want to point out is, on top of gas, which is the biggest source, you can see coal, but coal is not very large. And it only peaks during the winter, which is very interesting because there are many days during the summer and the spring where the UK doesn't burn any coal anymore. And it was even, if you see this in a percentage, coal doesn't represent more than about maybe 5, maximum 10%. Nuclear is about 20, very stable at the bottom. And then the renewables are obviously very variable. But I want to show you something. In 2017, the UK had its first coal-free day ever. So the country produced electricity without using any coal, which was a breakthrough at the time, because I want you to see what the energy mix was in the United Kingdom in 2009. So this is a little bit over 10 years ago. Please look at this chart. It's the same story, but now 10 years ago. Can you see how much coal was used in the UK? It was easily 40% of the mix. This reinforces what I have been saying. The energy transition is already underway. It is already happening. The question is, how are we adjusting to it, and what are the next steps that will follow? But it's very interesting to see how in the last 10 years, the UK basically eliminated coal. And we're seeing similar stories happening in other parts of the world. Let me give you a few case studies as we go along. So the world is already changing. It's not the first time it changes. This is a photograph that was taken in New York City in the year 1900. And it's a beautiful photo. It's Easter Sunday or Easter morning in 1900. And the question is, can you see the horse? There's a photograph right there. I'm sorry, can you spot the car? Forgive me. Can you spot the car? And you can see how the whole avenue is full of horse carriages. And there's only one car right here. Back in those days, the biggest problems in cities were the excrement, the manure, the excrement of horses, and when it rained, it got all muddy. And politicians used to get together to try to see how they could solve the problem of all this horse excrement. By 1913, just 13 years later, they took a photograph in the same place on the same day, and look at what happened. This is Easter Monday, 1913. It's the same avenue, and now the question is, can you see the horse? There's only one horse carriage somewhere here in the middle. You should be able to see it in yellow that I tried to highlight it. So this just reminds us, we sometimes don't recognize the phenomenal change that happened about 100 years ago when cars came along, and I believe we're in the beginning of another similar transition where maybe in less than 10 years we will see a similar change, and we will be using other types of transportation. So I don't know, I'm a bit of an optimist, but I like to always get excited about these things, because in the end it's human ingenuity and creativity solving problems and evolving or changing the world. This is the energy mix in the United States. This one is already changing as well. I know in the US they burn a lot of coal, but in 2020 that number is 30% below what it used to be the previous year. And I am not sure the numbers will recover quickly. But the interesting thing in this chart is not only the drop in coal. What I want you to see is the increase in renewables. And if I try to draw the line, you will find that renewables were bigger than coal for the first time in history in 2020. Even the Americans, even considering Mr. Trump's statements about coal, they are already changing. If you look at the whole world, we find that coal has decreased in the energy mix globally. Of course, gas has continued increasing, and some of the renewables are growing. Nuclear is not growing so much, but it is still growing. The only one that had a net decline was coal, and that was 2019. 2020 will be even more pronounced. What about China? I know we all think, well, no matter what we do in Europe or elsewhere, China will still continue burning coal. The answer is yes. China produces 10 times more coal than everybody else, and they consume it, and they even import on top of that. But China is also changing. Even though they are very large in coal, their share of coal in the energy mix dropped from 73% to 57%. I know it's still very high, but it is declining. And when you think of the consumption of oil, yes, today China is the biggest importer in the world, but the same story goes. The Chinese produce 70% of all solar panels, and they're growing in renewables and nuclear. I mean, of course, we need to, if China solves its problem or its contribution, it will have a massive effect on the rest of the world. But that doesn't mean the rest of the world shouldn't do anything until China does it. They are already doing something. And there's also a change in perception. Ultimately, it's psychology. It's the way we see the world and how we perceive it. And you may know about this, but big companies like BP and Shell, they have been making big statements about reinventing energy or reimagining energy. I don't know how familiar you are with BP, but BP has recently, they had a big event a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago, where they were making, basically saying, we're not going to be an oil and gas company anymore. We're going to be an energy company, regardless of where that energy comes from. So we can expect BP to invest in oil, in wind farms and so forth. Companies like Total in France, or Statoil, well, what used to be Statoil, it's now Equinor in Norway, doing the same things. And ExxonMobil, interestingly, was replaced from the Dow Jones or from the index of the largest companies. ExxonMobil was taken out after 92 years, and the investors are also changing. big companies, big investors like BlackRock, they're looking at fossil fuel companies, and they don't look so attractive anymore. They were always very attractive because they were big and they were stable and they had good dividends, but not anymore. So you see how, I mean, sometimes perception changes not immediately, but it takes a kind of a semi-generational or a generational shift. But once it shifts, you know, it never comes back, and it is already shifting. This is the hydrogen aircraft I was telling you about. So Airbus is thinking of doing this, which I thought it would be nice to show you. Obviously, these are still prototypes, but they're working on it. And there's obviously there's also the push of what we call the circular economy, which has different types of focus. And I'm just going to show you two little snapshots. Renewable gas is a big discussion as well. And I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues the other day, and we were talking about hydrogen, and he says, I don't believe hydrogen will be the one that solves the energy transition. It will be part of the story, but it will not be the big story. The bigger story is with renewable gas, and he has his own thinking behind this. But he says, look, so much that we have in landfills, how much CO2 that we produce in farms. If we can get that and we can collect the methane, and then we can use it for consumer use, we can use the biogas as a heating or you know, electricity source, but we could also use that CO2 or syngas. We could use it to produce chemicals. Let me show you, because the circular economy is also having a big effect on plastics. The whole idea of reuse, reducing, recycling, redesigning materials so that we eliminate the leakage of plastics, so that we don't landfill as much. I grew up in the petrochemical industry, so I have this story very close to my heart. And some companies are already taking interesting steps. LOreal recently announced, I don't know if you saw it, about maybe about a month ago, they said they're going to launch one of their plastic bottles is going to be made from carbon effluents from industry. Basically, those effluents contain CO, CO2, and some hydrogen, and they want to use those effluents to produce syngas, and then they're going to make plastics from that syngas. It's interesting, but it's expensive, and it's very small. I would assume this is more. I mean, L'Oreal is obviously trying to promote itself, which is fair, but this is not going to completely eliminate or change the way we make plastics today. More interesting, in my opinion, is what some companies like SABIC and BASF are doing in Europe. Again, this is mostly on the world of plastics, but what they're doing is they are taking they're taking organic waste, including plastic waste, and they are pyrolyzing it, and then they're feeding it into the steam crackers to produce petrochemical building blocks. Yes, this is well, SABIC is already working on this. They cannot substitute their entire naphtha feedstock, but they can do it with a few percentage points of this waste. So again, what I'm trying to tell you is, yes, the world is changing. It is changing already. We will still need oil, though. And if you ask Saudi Aramco about their vision of the future, this is what they will tell you. We still need energy, and we will have that energy. We will get you there. This is real energy. That's a big sign that Aramco put in Heathrow Airport. And how big will demand for oil be in the future? Well, that's the big question. There are many charts about this, but I still love this one, even though it's a few years old. But it's just a kind of a qualitative chart that tells us, if you think of the demand for oil today, which is somewhere around, I mean, it used to be about close to 100 million barrels per day around 2019. That was roughly the number we had. And then they said, okay, if we think what's the demand of oil going to be in 2040, then the numbers could be, if you ask the oil industry, they think it will continue increasing. The International Energy Agency used to say that it would grow still, but more modestly. But by the time you bring efficiency or other sorts of fuel, then you're going to have probably demand for oil of about 70 million barrels by 2040, even less than that. A lot of people, and me included, we believe we already passed the peak of oil. The peak of oil demand was in 2019. Based on what's happening today, I personally don't think that the demand for oil will continue, will go up again to that level or beyond. But this is the big point, and I want you to be aware of it. Even if you are down at 70, you still need those 70 million barrels, and somebody has to make them. And that's why Aramco is saying, well, we're betting on this. We will continue giving you that oil. And as you decommission capacity for oil, just imagine this line, the one that declines the most, the supply for oil also has to be decommissioned. And it will be declining in steps, which will also create some spikes in the price. That doesn't mean the price will be forever low. It could create spikes in the price because the way that demand drops and the way supply drops with it will not be a smooth ride. Again, I'm giving you things to think of, but it's just, I think, interesting to put it all together. Just a couple more minutes, I'll be done. My final thoughts on all this discussion. I still think that we need to collaborate as much as we can. I recently read a book by Johan Norberg. The book is called Open, and the book describes multiple cases in history where when societies and technology are open, the world advances at a much faster pace. When things close down, then completely the opposite happens. And I do believe that the role of international organizations like the International Energy Agency or the data provided by the BP Statistical Review or even our World in Data, this just helps people understand it better. That's what we need. And we need open markets, and we need open and political collaboration and open political and technological collaboration. Just think of what would have happened. Think of it like this. 2020 has been a very difficult year. But it's amazing when you think about how as soon as the virus was identified, within weeks, they identified it in China, within weeks, the Germans already had the whole sequence of DNA of the virus. And then within another few weeks, the Americans were already producing. Whenever did humans produce vaccines, 3 different vaccines in less than a year? We should be very proud of many of these achievements. And we do them when we are open. If we close down, we do not communicate, and we miss a lot of opportunities. And in terms of the transition itself, it will be, if you look at today, energy is very concentrated and it's controlled by a small group of companies or governments. I think tomorrow, the world of energy will be more decentralized, more local, multiple tailor-made solutions depending on where you are. So just to complete, the energy transition is already happening. We need to complement renewables. They cannot solve the problem on their own, and we need to take carbon out of the atmosphere. That's one thing that some people don't always know, but it's important. And let's work on those local and decentralized solutions. It is a big challenge, but it can be done, even if timing is short. So let's get to work. Thank you very much.